Hi, I'm Mary Rothbard. Taxation is theft. Purely and simply, here is why. Taxation is a compulsory seizure of the property of the state's inhabitants or subjects. Like the robber, the state demands money at the equivalent of a gunpoint, and if the taxpayer refuses to pay, his assets are seized by force, and if he tries to resist, if he tries to protect his property, he will be arrested or shot if he tries to resist the arrest. The appropriation of someone else's property without his consent is theft. If people are not paying their taxes voluntarily, then taxation is theft. Some state minions say that taxation is really voluntary, but one simple and instructive refutation of this claim is to ask, what would happen if the government abolished taxation and turned to requests for voluntary contributions? Does anyone really believe that anything comparable to the huge revenues of the state would continue to pour in its coffers? It is considered that in democratic governments, the act of voting makes the government and all its works and powers truly voluntary. There are many fallacies with this popular argument. In the first place, even if the majority of the public specifically endorsed each and every particular act of the government, this would simply be a tyranny of the majority, rather than a voluntary act undergone by every person in the country. Murder is murder, theft is theft, whether undertaken by one man against another or by a group, or even by the majority of the people within a given territorial area. The fact that a majority might support or accept an act of theft does not diminish the criminal essence of the act or its grave injustice. Secondly, in most of our current governments, differently of a direct democracy, people don't vote for specific measures, but for representatives, like a package deal. The representatives then impose their will for a fixed length of time, even if it is something that is not really representing the will of their voters. Part of these 2 points, voting can hardly endorse the legitimacy of the government over an individual. And finally, how is it that taxes are charged on every individual regardless of whether they voted or not, or more particularly, whether they voted for the winning candidate? How can either non-voting or voting for the loser indicate any sort of endorsement of the actions of the elected government? If there is no consent, it doesn't matter what kind of mental gymnastics someone might try to make to prove that taxation is legitimate. It is not. Taxation without consent is theft at a gunpoint. If then taxation is compulsory and is therefore indistinguishable from theft, the state, which subsists on taxation, is a vast criminal organization, much more dangerous and successful than any private mafia in history. Taxation should be considered criminal not only according to the theory of crime and property rights, but even according to the common apprehension of mankind, which always considers theft to be a crime. The German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer observed that there are 2 and only 2 ways of attaining wealth in society. A. By production and voluntary exchange with others, the method of the free market, and B. By violent expropriation of wealth produced by others. The first method benefits everyone involved, and the second method is the method of violence and theft, in which the state acts like a parasite, benefiting the looting group or the looting class at the expense of the looted. Oppenheimer termed the first method of obtaining wealth the economic means, and the second one the political means. Oppenheimer then defined the state as the organization of the political means. Only the government obtains its revenue by coercion, by threatening people with heavy penalties if they are not paying their taxes. If most of the public were really convinced of the legitimacy of the state, if they were really convinced that the state is nothing more than a bandit gang, then the state would soon collapse, and it would be considered just like another mafia gang. This is why there is this huge necessity of the government to fund or to employ ideologists to defend the state's rule. In fact, the function of the state's ideological minions and allies is to explain to the public that the emperor does indeed have a fine set of clothes and that he's not naked. What I mean by that is that these ideologists must explain to the public that while theft by one or more persons or groups is bad and criminal, when the state engages in such acts, it is not theft, but a legitimate and even holy act called taxation. These ideologists must explain that murder by one or more persons or groups is bad and it must be punished, but that when the state kills, it is not murder, but it's considered as a war or as a repression of internal subversion. They must explain that while kidnapping or slavery is bad and must be outlawed when done by private individuals or groups, when the state commits such acts, it is not kidnapping or slavery, but an act necessary to the public well-being. In the name of taxation, the state will kill, kidnap, and even enslave people, but it won't stop there. It will go further, and it will try to convince the public that all of that is just. Either a man owns his body or someone else does. Self-ownership means that every man is the owner of himself, having absolute control over his own body and over the fruits of his labor. This means that no one else should invade or aggress somebody or their legitimate held property. So, if you own your labor, you cannot be forced into supporting the state through taxes. If slavery is about forcing labor for the benefit of others, when the government takes part of what you earned against your will through taxes, it forces you to labor for the state. If you liked this video, share it around. Stay brave and stay free.